Welcome back to Nonstop Recap. Today we'll be going over the 2002 dark comedy, The Rules of Attraction. We start off at a raucous college party where Lauren contemplates giving her virginity to the handsome Victor. Meanwhile, her roommate Laura gets drunk and sleeps with the entire football team. Lauren wakes up settling for a film student and brings him to another girl's room, but she passes out and wakes to find a random townie taking advantage of her while the film student records it. Two guys barge in and roll a keg into the room, and the townie vomits onto Lauren's back. The action suddenly slams into reverse, and we're brought back downstairs where we meet Paul. Paul has a crush on a drug dealer named Sean Bateman, but he settles for a random jock. They do ecstasy together, and Paul tries to kiss him, but the jock attacks Paul and throws him out of the room. As Paul sits rejected in the hallway, we're thrown back into reverse, and our focus goes to Sean. He watches the women at the party before finally settling on a blonde he refers to as his prey. He lies to her about his name and age before taking her back to his room where he plays guitar and moves her to tears. As they make love, Sean begins narrating in third person as if he's somebody else. Our final reverse sequence brings us back to before the events of the party. A praying mantis crawls across Sean's face as he drunkenly dozes on the campus lawn, but he's eventually woken up when the sprinklers go off. He goes to the cafeteria where he receives a disappointing breakfast from a shy kitchen worker and throws it away without eating it. Meanwhile, Lauren gets to class and finds it canceled, while Paul does morning yoga. Sean checks his mail and finds a purple letter from a secret admirer. He then goes to visit his drug dealer, Rupert, who confronts Sean about a $3,000 debt that he owes. He starts to attack Sean, but decides to give him some time to repay the money. Sean informs Rupert and his man guest that there's an upcoming party and he should be able to unload some cocaine there. When Rupert accuses Sean of trying to play him for free blow, Sean sweet-talks Rupert with a story about his impoverished roots, which anyone who's read American Psycho knows to be a lie. They finally make a deal when Sean agrees to overcharge his customers. Sean then tries to collect on a debt from a druggie named Mark, but Mark's busy playing with his clarinet and ruminating about clocks. That night, at a different party, Paul watches a burning wicker man before trying to make a move on Mitchell. Mitchell pushes Paul away, but Paul follows after him until a girl shows up and invites Mitchell back to her room. She invites Paul to join in, but Mitchell turns him down. Sean shows up and cuts in front of Paul to get a beer, but the keg is tapped out. Paul offers to buy Sean dinner the following night, and Sean unenthusiastically agrees as the wicker man topples to the ground. The next morning, Lauren wakes up for a Saturday tutorial class. Sean awakes soon after, and we see him smoking a joint and enjoying a morning poop, while Lauren arrives on campus. She finds her professor passed out in his office, and she stops to smoke a joint left out on his desk. As she leaves, she runs into Sean in the hallway. They talk for a bit, and Sean begins to suspect that she might be his secret admirer. That night, Paul tries on clothes for his dinner with Sean when his friend Raymond bursts into the room and informs him that their friend Harry has overdosed. He drags Paul to Phil's dorm where Phil is taking care of Harry. Paul protests that he has plans with Sean, but Phil and Raymond shut him down. They take Harry to the hospital where the staff appear largely unconcerned with their emergency. A doctor finally approaches and gives Harry a once-over before pronouncing him dead. Even when Harry wakes up, the doctor refuses to alter his diagnosis, and Harry's friends leave with Harry in tow. Laura, meanwhile, pressures Lauren to attend that night's party and finds a hookup, but Lauren's not easily swayed. Sean sees Laura at the party and asks Lauren, but Laura says that she probably isn't coming because she's been reading about venereal diseases. Paul shows up and apologizes to Sean for missing dinner, but Sean doesn't care, until Paul says he has weed. Lauren soon arrives and asks Laura about Sean, only to learn that he's left with Paul. After Laura leaves, Lauren's professor approaches and they go back to his office. He feels her up and she decides to go all the way with him, but he's only interested in what she can do with her mouth. She's hesitant, but he gets what he wants by using her GPA as leverage. Paul and Sean get high together, and Sean fantasizes about Lauren while Paul fantasizes about Sean. As he watches Sean pass out, he begins pleasuring himself beneath a pillow. In the morning, they watch adult movies together until Paul's mother calls and invites him to dinner in the city. Paul tries to invite Sean along, but Sean already has party plans that night. He drives Paul to the bus station where Paul thinks about his love for Sean while Sean's head fills with thoughts of Lauren and food in that order. Sean returns to campus and checks his mail to find another purple note saying that tonight's the night. Lauren and Lara do drugs together while talking about Sean, and Lara unironically judges him for being a drug dealer just before she gets a nosebleed. Meanwhile, Sean touches himself while sniffing his anonymous love letter. Paul gets to his hotel in the city and calls Sean on the dormitory's hallway phone. Sean initially mistakes Paul for his psycho brother Patrick, and Paul gets jealous at the mention of another man's name. Afterward, Paul's old hookup Richard walks in and they roughhouse until their mothers show up and tell them to get downstairs for dinner. Richard asks Paul to take a shower with him, and they leave their mothers waiting while they dance around in their underwear. At dinner, Richard is obnoxiously disrespectful to his mother and feels Paul up under the table, but Paul gets embarrassed by his behavior. Richard's mother orders him to leave the table and he makes a scene on the way out. At the party, Sean sells Laura cocaine and asks her about Lauren, but she tells him that Lauren isn't coming. Sean goes back to Laura's room and makes love to her while staring at Lauren's photo on her wall. They both appear unsatisfied afterward, and Sean blames it on the drugs. The next day, another letter sits in Sean's mailbox. Sean's admirer, revealed to be the shy kitchen worker, saw him leave the party with Laura and is giving up on him. Love Lauren, she slits her wrist in the dormitory bathroom. Lauren, meanwhile, returns to her dorm and finds Sean getting dressed next to Laura's bed. He tries to confess his love to Lauren, but she retreats to the bathroom and sobs against the door until finding the kitchen worker's body in the tub. She tries to haul her out of the tub but is unable to save her. Paul arrives back on campus just as the girl's body is being taken away. As Lauren tries to shake the image of the girl from her mind, we revisit the earlier party scenes and see the kitchen worker watching Sean from the background of each one. Sean reads her last letter, still believing Lauren to be his admirer. He tries to speak with Lauren through her door, claiming that his one-night stand with Laura doesn't make him unfaithful to her. When Laura tells him that Lauren will never want to see him again, he punches her in the nose and knocks her out. Sean later sulks alone in his room when the phone rings. Annoyed, Sean sucker punches a pumpkin for staring at him before answering what turns out to be a call for his roommate. He angrily disconnects the phone and ties the cord to the ceiling before wrapping it around his throat and trying to hang himself, but it rips out of the ceiling and he survives. He then attempts to slit his wrists with a cheap razor, but it doesn't work, so he instead tries overdosing on the over-the-counter medications. Upon waking up, he spots a tube of fake blood next to his bed. Lauren comes by his room and finds him lying motionless with blood all over him, but he begins laughing and reveals that it's merely a prank. Lauren chastises him and leaves. We then cut to Victor giving a rapid-fire account of his recent trip to Europe, which mostly involves drugs and women, with a lot of food and one bombing thrown in for good measure. At the end, he says that he doesn't know who he is anymore. We then see Victor at a diner with Sean and Mitchell. Sean tells them he's in love with Lauren, but he starts to leave when they crack jokes at his expense. He stops when Victor asks to buy drugs. Sean demands the money up front, but Victor doesn't trust him and sends Mitchell along to oversee the purchase. Mitchell worries about using his car for a drug run, but Sean tells him to deal with it. They get to Rupert's and Sean attempts to make the purchase, but Rupert hounds him about the money he still owes. Things quickly escalate when Guest pulls a machete and Rupert's other men crowd around Sean and Mitchell. Sean makes the first attack, forcing Mitchell and himself to defend themselves with kitchen utensils, but they eventually run for the car after Rupert pulls a gun. Sean laughs insanely as he and Mitchell speed away. Mitchell yells at Sean and orders him out of the car, and Sean spits at him through the window on his way out. Lauren, meanwhile, flips through her VD book but starts crying and throws it to the ground. She cheers up, however, when a friend enters and tells her that Victor is back from Europe. Outside, Sean follows Lauren and tries to convince her that he really did attempt suicide before ultimately faking it. She tells him to give up because she's in love with Victor. He asks her about the letters and says that he wants to know her better, but she tells him that he will never know anybody. As she walks away, a snowflake falls and melts on Sean's eye. When Lauren arrives at Victor's, she finds him with another girl. Worse, he doesn't even remember who Lauren is. Meanwhile, Sean sits in the campus amphitheater drinking in the snow. Paul finds him and starts to express his feelings, but Sean shuts down with the same harsh rejection speech he received from Lauren. Paul screams at Sean and runs away in tears. Sean afterwards goes to check his mailbox but finds it empty. Rupert and Guest enter, cornering Sean before beating him with a baseball bat. We then find ourselves back at the party that started the movie. Sean watches Lauren head off with the film major before tearing up his last purple note. We then see Lauren, Paul, and Sean frozen in moments of despair. However, rather than hooking up with the hot blonde from the opening scene, Sean turns and leaves the party entirely. Lauren runs into Paul outside and asks her about Sean's love letters, but she says they had nothing to do with her. They then watch Sean leave on his motorcycle with plans of never returning. He briefly narrates about his feelings for Lauren, but he's unceremoniously interrupted when the film cuts to black and the credits play through in reverse. Thanks for watching Nonstop Recap.